attempt to raid your work and steal the jobs that your ethnic group owned? Or would you get ill, which was quite common, and be unable to continue working on a regular basis? Then you would fall down into the lower group. You, as the head of the household, we're talking about the male, might not be able to work and might have medical bills, or might be deferring medical care, but your wife and your children would have to go out and work so you didn't starve. It was very easy to fall below the poverty line, though it was also relatively easy to crawl up out of the poverty, above the poverty line. But the instability, the unpredictability of the situation increased the anxiety that workers had when they were confronting their employers or each other. And it augmented the potential for violence when it was not possible to resolve worker management disputes. Violence between racial and ethnic groups was endemic because of efforts to remove competition from groups that, for a variety of reasons, employers could hire more cheaply. Agitation against Chinese workers was the most notorious example of this effort. And thus, particularly in the West Coast, European descent workers or European immigrant workers would, and particularly Irish immigrants, would identify jobs that Chinese workers were doing and then go in and beat up the workers while they were working, chase them off, and then confront the employer and say, you hire Irish, fire all the Chinese, and you hire Irish, or you will regret it. And if the employer didn't go along, there might be something blown up or burned down, or even somebody killed. Some of the ethnic groups were not playing when they decided to go after a job. And they weren't. They were doing it primarily because it was a question of better those other people starve than me and mine. But an agitation against Chinese workers was the most notorious example of this. But complaints about cheap Italian labor were very common on the East Coast. Irish workers were cheaper than German or American, meaning old stock pre-Civil War Americans. And both groups, both Germans and Yankees, let's call them, fought to keep Irish out of their jobs and away from their towns. Those who could work for less had no reason not to undercut the pay that other more privileged groups received. And indeed, the closer you were to the bottom, the more desperate you were, and equally important, the labor contractors who negotiated access to jobs profited from maintaining low wages for the workers they represented. And this was particularly true in the Chinese and Italian communities, where labor contractors were firmly in control of access to jobs for individuals from those groups. And that, in fact, reinforced stereotypes that both groups had developed in the United States of group servility. In a situation where most could not know of or begin to comprehend or follow the fights that were going on within the communities, and for the most part probably didn't care. So the most highly skilled workers, the top 15%, made over $800 a year. They were the glass blowers, the pattern makers, the railroad engineers. They were able to live in lower middle class neighborhoods And they often moved out to the cheaper suburbs where they could buy a home. They didn't build their own home. They bought a home that was already made. They would be the people who would be populating South San Francisco or Daly City, maybe, or the Sunset District, if you're in San Francisco, or Richmond, when it was a smaller semi-farm town. They were willing to pay more for public improvements, and they insisted on sending their children to good schools. And the education was extremely important to this group. So their children, the males as well as the females, went to high school. So this was the group out of which the new middle class was, the recruits for the new middle class was emerging. And their children were also the prime candidates for going to college, to university, after the middle class, of course. And it was this group that was the sort of provided the leadership for the trade union movement. Okay, there I am. So, and thus I think it's time to start talking about the organized trade union movement. The thing about the skilled workers that made them particularly central in all of this was that they had a skill that was not easily learned. So it took, employers couldn't just fire them because it was a matter of several years of training and practical experience before somebody else would be able to take the job. The largest trade union in the United States at this time was the Musicians Union, which I point out because I think it typifies what was special about many of the unions. Musicians obviously have a skill that you don't just pick up overnight, or most people don't. There were a lot of musicians' jobs at the time, and it, generally, so someone who started playing a musical instrument when they were a child and they developed some skill for that, it sure beat being a clarinet or a violin player in a theater or a bar than working in a factory. And you made pretty good money, and you were a skilled worker. So, and you could, really, the employer couldn't do too much. If the musicians banded together, there was nothing a recalcitrant employer could do, because you're not going to find a clarinet player just any old place. And it is the same thing for a trained foundry worker, for a metal worker, for a carpenter, for plumbers, and so forth. These were jobs that took some time to learn. There were two major trade union movements at the end of the 19th century. They had very different philosophies. The first was the Knights of Labor, which was founded in 1869 by two skilled garment cutters who were working in Philadelphia. Uriah Stevens and James Wright. And they founded the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor in Philadelphia, basically as a secret fraternal organization modeled on the Freemasons to some degree. And much of the organization's activities involved secret rituals and ceremonies that would bind people together and create internal hierarchies. The group was still primarily a social organization for working men, whose primary practical thing, besides the entertainment and socializing options that it provided, was death and sickness benefits for its members. And by 1877, It had 500 lodges scattered around the country and about 6,000 members. And it was, as the Knights of Labor, what distinguished it from other fraternal organizations, that it was specifically about the primary identification was that you were a working man. Not that you were of this ethnic group or that ethnic group, or a Catholic or a Protestant. It was you were a working man. So it was projecting an alternative kind of identity based on manliness, and the primary sign for manliness was your ability to hold down a good job and earn good wages. In 1878, the Knights of Labor went public when it came under the leadership of Terence Powderly, who was a machinist. And the Knights of Labor proclaimed, and before you had to know somebody and then they would recruit you, so it was a kind of semi-secret thing. But by going public, they began a recruitment campaign, and the Knights proclaimed that they were open to all members of the producing classes, regardless of occupation, nationality, race, religion, or sex. The goals, they said, the external goals, the internal goals, the socializing goals remain the same, but they were now adding on the goals of banding together to achieve better working conditions and to restore a social order based on equality and a cooperation. So they were responding to the rise of the new managerial corporation by asserting the foundational importance of the working man's republic. That was what the United States, in their minds, was founded as, outside of the slave-owning South. And therefore, in the face of the corporation, working men of all sorts had to band together to reaffirm that the United States was a working man's republic. The only occupations that were explicitly barred from membership were bankers, who everybody hated, stockbrokers, ditto, lawyers, even more so, liquor dealers, and gamblers. So in Scranton, Pennsylvania, George Scranton, where if he still owned his foundry, which he didn't by 1878, would have been invited to join the Knights of Labor. So the working man's republic was going to maintain this fraternal relationship between employers and employees by bringing them, the small employer and the men with whom he worked, were going to belong to this organization which was going to fight to maintain the kind of society and the kind of political system that had grown out of this close set of interpersonal relations. It was not to replace the small owner, who was seen as providing a useful function, but to assure that he would not be driven out of business. They started doing this because in the aftermath of the July 1877 National Railroad strike, the Knights of Labor had already begun growing quite rapidly. That is, the working class response to that strike and its violence was to start looking for a group that was not locally defined, that was not ethnically defined, but